The maid was left heartbroken. What her billionaire boss did made her forget her ex. The coastal bus lurched to a stop, its brakes squealing against the salty air. Elena clutched her worn leather suitcase tighter, her knuckles white as she stepped down onto the cracked sidewalk. The job letter in her jacket pocket felt heavy, like it carried the weight of all her hopes. Before her stood Seaview Manor, a once grand Victorian estate that had clearly seen better days. Paint peeled from the wooden siding in long, tired strips, and several shutters hung crooked against weathered windows. The garden, which must have been beautiful once, had surrendered to tangles of wild roses and overgrown hedges. "Last stop, miss," the bus driver called out, already closing the doors. The bus pulled away, leaving Elena alone with the sound of waves crashing against the nearby cliffs and seagulls wheeling overhead. She took a deep breath of the briny air. "Well, this is it," she whispered to herself, adjusting her grip on the suitcase that contained everything she owned in the world. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, making the house look even more imposing. The job letter had promised room and board, along with a modest salary for housekeeping duties. It wasn't much, but after everything that had happened in the city, the layoff, the breakup, the mounting bills, it was her last chance at a fresh start. Elena's shoes crunched on the gravel path as she made her way to the front door. A wind chime made of sea glass tinkled softly from the wraparound porch, its colors catching the fading sunlight. She said a quick prayer under her breath, something her grandmother had taught her. "Lord, guide my steps on this new path." The heavy brass knocker echoed through the house. After a moment, she heard footsteps approaching. Mrs. Harrison, the elderly owner she'd spoken with on the phone, opened the door. Her silver hair was tied back in a neat bun, and despite the house's condition, she carried herself with dignity. "Elena, dear, right on time," Mrs. Harrison said warmly. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted from your journey." The interior of the house was like stepping back in time. Faded wallpaper, antique furniture draped in dust covers, and a grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. The air smelled of old books and furniture polish. "Your room is in the attic," Mrs. Harrison explained, as she led Elena up 2 flights of stairs. "It's small, but it has the best view in the house." The attic room was indeed tiny, with sloped ceilings and dormer windows. But it was clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a small desk beneath one of the windows. A crack in the window pane let in the sound of the ocean, a constant, soothing rhythm. "I'll leave you to get settled," Mrs. Harrison said. "Dinner's at 6 if you're feeling up to it." Alone in her new room, Elena unpacked her meager belongings, a few changes of clothes, some photographs, her mother's old Bible. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that reflected off the water visible through her window. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the waves through the cracked glass. The sound was hypnotic, like a heartbeat. Maybe this old house needed her as much as she needed it. Elena smoothed her hand over the worn quilt on the bed and made a promise to herself. She would rebuild her life here, one honest task at a time. The dying light cast shadows across the wooden floorboards, and the salty breeze carried the promise of tomorrow through the cracked window. For the first time in months, Elena felt something close to peace. Morning light streamed through the cracked attic window, waking Elena earlier than usual. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she dressed quickly in her work clothes, sturdy jeans and a faded blue shirt. She'd barely slept, the unfamiliar sounds of the old house and crashing waves keeping her mind active. Making her way down the narrow stairs, she caught the scent of coffee drifting up from below. In the kitchen, she found a man about her age standing by an ancient stove, pouring coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression reserved but kind. "You must be Elena," he said, offering her one of the mugs. "I'm Thomas Whitaker, the estate's owner." Elena accepted the coffee with surprise. On the phone, she'd spoken with Mrs. Harrison. "I thought—" "Mrs. Harrison is my housekeeper," Thomas explained, his voice quiet and steady. "She helps manage things when I'm away on business, which is often." He gestured to a chair at the worn kitchen table. "Please, sit." The coffee was strong and good, exactly what she needed. Thomas sat across from her, his own mug cupped between his hands. He wore simple work clothes, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms marked with old paint stains. "There's quite a bit to be done," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "The shutters need repair before storm season, and the inside hasn't had a proper cleaning in." He paused, a flash of something like sadness crossing his face. "Well, in quite some time." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Elena said firmly. Thomas's lips curved in a slight smile. "Good. We'll start with the east wing today. I'll show you what needs doing." They spent the morning working side by side, Thomas teaching her the proper way to clean the antique woodwork without damaging it. His instructions were clear and patient, and he worked alongside her instead of simply directing. The morning passed in comfortable quiet, broken only by the occasional question or explanation. By afternoon, they'd moved outside to tackle the shutters. Thomas steadied the ladder while Elena climbed up to examine the hardware. "These aren't too bad," she called down. "The hinges just need cleaning and oiling." "There's a toolbox in the garden shed," Thomas replied. "I'll get it." The work was satisfying, even as the salt air made her skin sticky and her hair wild. Thomas remained nearby, always ready to help but never hovering. His quiet presence was oddly comforting. As the sun began to set, Thomas surprised her again. "Have you eaten?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "I made extra soup." They sat on the back steps, bowls of homemade vegetable soup balanced on their knees. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of the ocean and late summer flowers. Crickets chirped in the overgrown garden, and the last rays of sunlight turned the old house's windows to gold. "Thank you," Elena said softly, not just meaning the soup. After months of chaos and heartbreak, this simple meal on worn stone steps felt like the first moment of real peace she'd found. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. They finished their meal in companionable silence, watching the sun sink into the sea while the old house settled around them. For the first time since arriving, Elena felt her tight shoulders relax, her bruised heart beginning to ease. Maybe here, in this weather-worn house by the sea, she could finally start to heal. The afternoon sun beat down on Elena's shoulders as she worked methodically at the wooden shutter laid across two sawhorses. Sweat trickled down her neck and sawdust coated her arms, but she kept at it, running the sandpaper in smooth, even strokes, just as Thomas had shown her. The repetitive motion was almost meditative, helping quiet the thoughts that usually crowded her mind. The crunch of footsteps on gravel made her look up. Thomas approached, his dress shirt exchanged for a work-worn t-shirt, sleeves rolled to expose sun-browned forearms. He carried another piece of sandpaper and a fresh water bottle. "Thought you might need this," he said, holding out the water. The plastic was cool against Elena's dusty fingers. "Thank you." She took a long drink, watching as Thomas set up a second set of sawhorses nearby. Without fanfare, he picked up one of the waiting shutters and began working, his movements steady and practiced. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by the soft scratch of sandpaper on wood and distant seabirds. Elena found herself stealing glances at Thomas, noting how he seemed perfectly content to work beside her, rather than supervise from afar. It was so different from Mark, who'd always needed to be in charge, to direct, to control. She pressed harder with the sandpaper, pushing the memory away. "Easy there." Thomas's gentle voice broke through her thoughts. "Let the paper do the work. Too much pressure will create grooves." Elena relaxed her grip, matching her strokes to his rhythm. "Sorry, got lost in thought for a moment." "The work helps with that, doesn't it?" There was understanding in his voice. "Sometimes it's easier to think when your hands are busy." She nodded, surprised by how well he'd read her. "It does help. Back home, She paused, the words sticking in her throat. Well, there wasn't much physical work to do, just a lot of time to think. Thomas hummed in acknowledgement, but didn't push for more. Instead, he showed her how to check for rough spots by running her fingers against the grain. His hands were calloused but gentle as he demonstrated the technique. The afternoon wore on, the pile of finished shutters growing steadily. They developed an easy rhythm. Sand, check, flip, repeat. The simple routine, and Thomas's quiet presence, helped keep Elena anchored in the present, away from darker thoughts. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they stood back to admire their work. The shutters lay in neat rows, their wood smooth and ready for painting. The sea breeze carried the sweet scent of beach roses from the overgrown garden, and somewhere in the distance, a gull called. "They look good," Thomas said, satisfaction warm in his voice. "You've done well." Elena ran her hand over the nearest shutter, feeling the satiny finish under her fingers. "It feels good," she admitted softly. "To fix something broken." She took a deep breath, surprised by how easily it came. "I haven't been able to breathe like this since—" She gestured vaguely, not ready to speak Mark's name aloud. Thomas nodded, his eyes kind, but not pitying. They stood together in the golden evening light, watching the sun paint the old shutters in shades of amber and rose, while the steady rhythm of the waves provided a gentle backdrop to their shared silence. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Elena made her way to the garden beds that wrapped around the estate's wraparound porch. Tangled weeds had taken over, choking out whatever had once grown there. She tugged on her work gloves, determined to bring some order to the chaos. The sun climbed higher as she worked, pulling stubborn weeds and clearing years of dead leaves. Sweat dampened her shirt, but the physical labor felt good, purposeful. Each time she cleared another patch, she could better imagine how the garden might have looked in its prime. The screen door creaked, and Thomas emerged with 2 glasses of ice water. "Making progress," he observed, handing her a glass. Elena wiped her forehead with her sleeve and took a grateful sip. "It's actually not as bad as it looks. The soil underneath is still good." She crumbled some dirt between her fingers. "Rich and dark. It just needs a chance." Thomas knelt beside her, examining the cleared bed. "What did you have in mind?" "Well—" Elena hesitated, then pushed forward. "I was thinking it needs something living, not just cleaned up, but growing." She gestured to the empty beds. "Maybe some flowers or herbs, something to bring some color back." Thomas ran his hand through the soil, considering. "Been a while since anything grew here besides weeds." His voice was quiet, touched with something Elena couldn't quite name. "My wife used to keep a garden, roses mainly, and some herbs for cooking." Elena watched his face, noting the gentle sadness there. "We could start small," she suggested softly. "Maybe some hardy annuals. They're forgiving, and they bloom quickly." Thomas stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "I might have some seeds in the garden shed. Martha, my wife, she always kept extra packets." He paused. Never could bring myself to clear it out. They walked together to the old shed. Thomas worked the rusty lock while Elena held her breath, feeling like they were opening something more than just a door. Inside, dusty shelves held terracotta pots and garden tools. In a corner, a wooden box sat waiting. Thomas lifted it carefully, bringing it into the light. Inside, neatly organized seed packets showed their age but remained sealed. Zinnias, he read. Marigolds, nasturtiums. His fingers trembled slightly as he sorted through them. Perfect choices, Elena said warmly. They're all strong flowers. Good for beginners. The day passed in continued clearing and preparation. Elena worked steadily, aware of Thomas coming and going, checking on her progress. As dusk approached, he appeared with 2 garden trowels and the seed packets. Thought we might plant them now, he said. The evening's cool, and there's rain in the forecast. The porch light clicked on automatically as darkness fell, casting a warm glow over their work. They knelt together in the soft dirt, making shallow trenches with their trowels. Elena showed Thomas how to space the seeds properly, their hands working in tandem. Gently now, she murmured, demonstrating how to cover the seeds with just enough soil. They need room to breathe, to push through. Their fingers worked in the earth, patting soil over tiny seeds full of possibility. The ocean's rhythm provided a gentle soundtrack, mixing with the evening crickets. With each seed they planted, Elena felt something else, taking root, something warm and hopeful in her chest. When the last seed was tucked in, they sat back on their heels, surveying their work. The beds looked bare in the porch light, but Elena could already imagine the bright blooms to come. She glanced at Thomas and found him smiling, really smiling, for the first time since she'd arrived. Elena's footsteps creaked on the attic stairs as afternoon sunlight filtered through dusty windows. The space needed a thorough cleaning, and she figured she might as well start with her own corner of the house. Armed with a feather duster and cleaning supplies, she began tackling the layers of dust coating the furniture. Behind a weathered trunk, she spotted a cardboard box that had seen better days. As she pulled it out, the bottom gave way, spilling old papers across the floor. Elena knelt down, gathering the scattered contents, when a particular photograph caught her eye. The black and white image showed the estate in its prime, probably from the 1960s. The paint was fresh, the shutters hung straight, and the garden beds burst with flowers. But what made Elena's hands tremble was the woman standing on the front porch. "It can't be," she whispered, sitting down hard on the wooden floor. The woman in the photo could have been her grandmother's twin. The same high cheekbones, the same gentle smile, even the way she held herself, one hand resting on the porch railing, head tilted slightly. Elena had seen that exact pose in old family photos dozens of times. She turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "Rose, Summer, 1965. The name meant nothing to her, but the handwriting was elegant and precise. Along with the photo, she found an envelope, its paper yellow with age. The seal was broken, but whatever letter it had contained was long gone. Sunlight slanted through the windows as Elena sat cross-legged on the floor, studying every detail of the photograph. The woman, Rose, wore a simple cotton dress and a garden apron. Behind her, the estate looked alive, loved, nothing like its current state of gentle decay. Questions tumbled through her mind. Who was Rose? Why did she look so much like Elena's grandmother? And what connection did she have to this place that was slowly beginning to feel like home? The dinner bell rang downstairs, startling Elena from her thoughts. She carefully placed the photo and envelope in her dresser drawer, smoothing them flat. The mystery would have to wait until after she'd cleaned up and eaten. That evening, Elena sat on her bed, the photo propped against her lamp. She'd washed the dust from the envelope, revealing an address in familiar handwriting, her grandmother's distinctive script. The pieces weren't fitting together, but they nagged at her like a half-remembered dream. She traced her finger over Rose's face in the photograph. The resemblance was uncanny, almost unsettling. Tomorrow, she decided, she would show it to Thomas. Perhaps he knew something about the woman who had once stood so proudly on his porch, looking for all the world like she belonged there. The sound of waves drifted through her window as Elena carefully returned the items to her drawer. The mystery of Rose and the envelope would keep until morning. But as she prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something important, something that might explain why this place felt so familiar from the moment she first saw it. Elena woke before sunrise, the photograph and envelope burning a hole in her dresser drawer. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities. As morning light crept through her window, she retrieved the items with trembling hands and made her way downstairs. She found Thomas in the kitchen, preparing coffee with methodical care. The familiar aroma filled the room as he looked up, offering her a gentle nod. "Good morning," he said, reaching for a second mug. "You're up early." Elena's throat felt dry. "I found something yesterday in the attic." She placed the photograph on the kitchen counter between them, smoothing its worn corners. "This woman here, she looks exactly like my grandmother." Thomas set down the coffee pot and picked up the photograph. His expression remained calm, but Elena noticed his shoulders tense slightly. "Her name was Rose," he said quietly. "There's more." Elena's fingers shook as she pulled out the envelope. "This has my grandmother's handwriting on it. I'd recognize it anywhere. I have all her old recipe cards." Thomas studied the envelope, then looked at Elena with careful consideration. "What was your grandmother's name?" "Rose," Elena whispered. "Rose Moore." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the wall clock. Thomas set his coffee mug down slowly, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "Rose Moore was the original owner of this estate," he said. "She sold it to my family in 1965, shortly after this photograph was taken." Elena's knees felt weak. She gripped the counter edge, her mind spinning. "But she never mentioned living here. She never said anything about owning a house by the sea." "Sometimes the hardest stories are the ones we can't bring ourselves to tell," Thomas said softly. He pulled out a kitchen chair. "Please, sit." Elena sank into the chair, staring at the photograph. Her grandmother, young, vibrant, standing proudly on the porch of this very house. How many times had she walked these same halls, tended those same garden beds Elena was now trying to restore? "The estate was beautiful then," Thomas continued, his voice gentle. "Your grandmother maintained every inch of it herself. The gardens were famous up and down the coast." "Why did she sell it?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. "That's a complicated story, one that deserves proper time and attention." He glanced at the clock. "I have some documents in the study that might help explain things. Would you be willing to meet me there after lunch? There's quite a bit to discuss." Elena nodded, her mind still reeling from the revelation. She looked down at the photograph again, seeing it with new eyes. Every detail of the house in its prime now held deeper meaning. This wasn't just any historic estate. This was her grandmother's home. The morning passed in a blur as Elena went through her usual tasks. Her hands moved automatically, dusting and cleaning, but her thoughts remained fixed on Rose Moore, her grandmother, standing on that porch. Every room she entered now held the ghost of a memory she'd never known existed. As lunchtime approached, Elena found herself moving slower, both dreading and longing to learn more. She made herself a simple sandwich, but could barely eat, her stomach tight with anticipation. The study door remained closed, and she could hear Thomas moving around inside, presumably preparing for their afternoon meeting. Sitting in the kitchen, watching the clock tick toward their appointed time, Elena tried to steady her nerves. Whatever story waited for her in that study would change everything she thought she knew about her family, and possibly explain why she'd felt drawn to this place from the very beginning. The study was bathed in warm lamplight as Elena entered. Thomas stood by his desk, several leather-bound journals and folders spread across its surface. The room smelled of old paper and wood polish, and the setting sun cast long shadows through the windows. "Please, sit." Thomas gestured to a comfortable armchair. His voice was gentle but carried a weight she hadn't heard before. Elena lowered herself into the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The grandfather clock in the corner marked each second with deliberate precision. Thomas picked up one of the journals, its pages yellow with age. "This was my mother's," he said, running his fingers along its worn spine. "She was friends with your grandmother, Rose." He opened the journal carefully. "When your grandmother sold this place, it wasn't by choice. The bank was threatening foreclosure after a series of poor investments by your grandfather. My father bought it, but my mother—" He paused, choosing his words. "She never felt right about it." Elena's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "Rose loved this house more than anything. My mother wrote about how it broke her heart to see Rose leave." Thomas pulled out a letter from between the journal's pages. "Before my mother passed, she made me promise something. She wanted this house returned to the family who loved it most." Elena's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I bought this estate 5 years ago with one purpose." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "To fulfill my mother's promise. To return it to Rose Moore's family." The room seemed to spin. Elena gripped the arms of her chair. "But the job listing, my being here—" "Was no accident," Thomas admitted. "When I learned Rose had a granddaughter working as a housekeeper in the city, I hoped you might have inherited her love for this place." He gestured to the work they'd done together. "Watching you restore these rooms, tend the garden, you have the same care, the same touch she did." Tears welled in Elena's eyes. "So all of this, my job here—" "The house is yours, Elena. It always has been. I'm just the caretaker, holding it until you were ready." Thomas's voice was soft but firm. "You don't have to accept it, but I hope you'll consider making it your home again." Elena stood abruptly, overwhelmed. The walls seemed to close in, memories of her grandmother mixing with her own recent experiences here. The shutters she'd fixed, the garden she'd started to restore, even her small attic room. Everything took on new meaning. I need some time," she managed to say. Thomas nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Elena left the study in a daze, walking the familiar hallway as if seeing it for the first time. Her fingers traced the wallpaper, feeling every imperfection, every place that needed care. This house, her grandmother's house, could be hers. But after her last relationship, after being betrayed and left with nothing, the idea of accepting such an enormous gift terrified her. What if it was too good to be true? What if there were strings attached she couldn't see? She stopped in the middle of the hallway, moonlight streaming through the windows. The house creaked and settled around her, its familiar sounds both comforting and overwhelming. Hope bubbled up inside her chest, warring with fear. Hope for a true home. Fear of trusting again. She stood there, caught between the past and future, listening to the sound of waves in the distance, and feeling the weight of her grandmother's legacy in every board beneath her feet. Morning light filtered through the study windows as Elena settled into the leather armchair. a stack of journals beside her. She opened the first one with trembling fingers, careful not to damage the delicate pages. Thomas worked quietly at his desk across the room, his presence both reassuring and unobtrusive. "Margaret Whittaker," Elena whispered, reading the name inscribed on the first page. The handwriting was elegant but practical, much like the woman Thomas had described. As Elena turned the pages, her grandmother's life unfolded through another woman's eyes. Margaret wrote about garden parties, where Rose Moore's laughter brightened the summer air, about afternoons spent sharing tea and dreams, about the way Rose transformed the estate into a home where everyone felt welcome. "She loved the rose garden most," Thomas said softly from his desk, noticing Elena lingering on a particular entry. "My mother wrote that your grandmother could make anything grow." Elena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She remembered her own grandmother's small apartment garden, how even there she'd managed to coax flowers from the most unlikely spots. The journals painted a picture of two families intertwined by friendship and circumstance. Margaret wrote of watching helplessly as Rose's husband made one poor decision after another, of seeing worry lines deepen on her friend's face. The entry about the day Rose had to sell the estate was tear-stained, the ink blurred. "Your mother," Elena said, looking up at Thomas. "She tried to help, didn't she?" Thomas set down his pen. "She did. She begged my father to find another way, but by then it was too late. The bank was forcing the sale." He paused. "That's why she made me promise. She couldn't save it then, but she wanted to make it right someday." Elena continued reading through the morning, stopping only when Thomas brought her a cup of tea. The journals revealed more than just history. They showed how much both women had loved this place, how it had been more than just a house to them. As afternoon approached, Thomas stood. "Would you like to walk the grounds? There's something I'd like to show you." Outside, the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and newly turned earth from their garden. They walked in comfortable silence until Thomas stopped at an old oak tree. "This was their favorite spot," he said, pointing to a worn bench beneath the branches. "My mother wrote about how she and your grandmother would sit here and watch their children play." Elena touched the rough bark of the tree, connecting past to present. "Thomas, I'm grateful, more than I can say. But it's overwhelming." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Which is why I'm suggesting you stay on as caretaker for now. Take time to know the place, to be sure it's what you want. We can sort out the legal details when you're ready." Relief flooded through Elena. "You'd do that?" "Of course. This isn't about rushing you into a decision. It's about honoring two women who understood what makes a house a home." He smiled slightly. "Besides, we still have shutters to fix." They walked back toward the house as evening settled over the grounds. Elena felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the weight of the story had made it easier to bear. She still couldn't quite believe this was happening, but with each step, each breath of sea air, she felt more certain about staying. The estate rose before them, its windows catching the last light of day. Elena saw it with new eyes now, not just as a job or a shelter, but as a place where hope had persisted through generations, waiting to come full circle. Elena walked down Main Street, breathing in the salty morning air. The small coastal town hadn't changed much since her childhood visits. The same weathered storefronts, the same creaky wooden benches along the sidewalk, the same cheerful window displays in the local shops. She pushed open the door to Carter's General Store, a bell jingling overhead. Behind the counter, old Mr. Carter looked up from his newspaper, his weathered face breaking into a surprised smile. "Well, if it isn't Rose Moore's granddaughter." He adjusted his glasses. "I'd know those eyes anywhere. Same as your grandmother's." Elena's heart skipped. You knew my grandmother? Knew her? Why, everyone knew Rose. He chuckled warmly. Used to come in here every Thursday for her groceries, always had a kind word for everyone, and those garden parties of hers, the whole town looked forward to them. An elderly woman browsing the shelves turned at their conversation. Did I hear you mention Rose Moore? She came closer, smiling. I'm Martha Lewis. Your grandmother taught me everything I know about roses. My garden's never been the same since she left. Elena found herself surrounded by stories as more morning shoppers recognized her family name. They spoke of summer festivals hosted on the estate's lawn, of Rose's famous lemon cake at church socials, of her quiet generosity during hard times. Such a shame about the estate, Martha sighed. Nearly broke your grandmother's heart to sell it, but times were different then, and with your grandfather's medical bills. The place just wasn't the same after the Moores left, Mr. Carter added, though young Thomas Whitaker's been fixing it up proper these past few years. Quiet fellow, but good-hearted, like his mother. Elena wandered through town, collecting memories like seashells. At the bakery, Mrs. Peterson recalled how Rose would order special birthday treats for neighborhood children who couldn't afford them. The hardware store owner remembered her grandmother's determination to fix things herself before asking for help. Each story added another brushstroke to the portrait of her grandmother, not just the gentlewoman Elena had known in her later years, but the vibrant soul who had made the estate a heart of the community. By afternoon, Elena's steps led her back to the estate. She found Thomas in the garden, carefully pruning an old rose bush. The whole town remembers her, Elena said softly, sitting on a nearby bench. They all speak about her like she just left yesterday. Thomas nodded, setting down his shears. Good people leave lasting impressions. My mother used to say your grandmother had a gift for making everyone feel at home. I think I understand now why this place meant so much to her. Elena looked up at the house, seeing it through the lens of all the stories she'd heard. It wasn't just a beautiful house. It was a gathering place, a shelter for anyone who needed it. That evening, Elena sat at her small desk by the window, paper and pen before her. The setting sun painted the room in warm gold as she began to write. Dear Grandma, today I walked the streets you once walked and heard stories about the life you lived here. I wish I had known to ask you more about this place while you were alive. But somehow, being here, working in the garden you once tended, sleeping under the same roof where you raised my father, I feel closer to you than ever. I think I understand now why you never spoke much about the estate. Some loves are too deep for words, but I want you to know that it's being cared for, and that somehow through all these years, it was waiting for us to come home. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Elena met Thomas on the front steps. He carried a leather briefcase filled with carefully organized papers, the old deed, his mother's journals, and other documents he'd gathered over the years. Ready? He asked softly. Elena nodded, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. The county records office was housed in an imposing brick building in the center of town, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust. An elderly clerk named Mrs. Harrison led them to a research room lined with metal filing cabinets and ancient leather-bound volumes. Property records from that era are all handwritten, she explained, pulling out several heavy books. But the indexing system is quite thorough. Thomas spread their documents across a wooden table while Elena carefully opened the first record book. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced down columns of elegant cursive. Here, she whispered after several minutes. Moore, Rose, and William. The entry showed the original purchase date, the price paid, and her grandparents' signatures in faded ink. Thomas leaned in, comparing it to the papers from his briefcase. The dates match perfectly. They spent the next few hours following the paper trail. Each document revealed another piece of the story. The initial purchase, years of tax records showing her grandparents' careful stewardship, and finally, the painful sale when medical bills had overwhelmed them. Mrs. Harrison helped them locate additional records, bringing out more books and files. "Your grandmother was well respected in the county offices," she told Elena. "She served on several community boards. Such a shame when they had to sell." Elena found herself blinking back tears as she read through the final transfer documents. Her grandmother's signature was shakier there, showing the stress of that difficult time. Thomas quietly placed a hand on the page. "My mother witnessed all of this," he said softly. "That's why she made me promise. She couldn't stop the sale back then, but she wanted to make it right someday." They organized the documents chronologically, creating a clear chain of ownership. Mrs. Harrison provided official copies, stamping each one with the county seal. "Everything's in order," she confirmed. "The property legally passed from the Moore family to the current owner, Mr. Whitaker." By late afternoon, they stepped out into the warm sunshine. Elena held the folder of certified copies close to her chest, still processing everything they'd discovered. Thomas turned to her on the courthouse steps. "I want to do this properly," he said. "Not just hand over keys, but restore your family's legacy with the dignity it deserves. We'll take whatever time you need to make arrangements, handle the legal details correctly." Elena looked at him, seeing the same quiet integrity that had impressed her from their first meeting. The truth was there in black and white now. This man had spent years preparing to give away something precious, simply because he believed it was right. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for the house, but for caring about its history, about my grandmother's story." A warm breeze rustled the papers in her hands, carrying the distant sound of waves. The estate that had seemed so intimidating when she first arrived now felt like it was welcoming her home. The morning light streamed through the old windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors Elena had come to know so well. She was cleaning the living room windows, carefully wiping years of salt spray from the glass, when something caught her eye. A slight gap in the wooden frame, barely noticeable unless you were inches away, revealed a hint of yellowed paper. Her heart quickened as she gently worked her fingernail into the crack. The wood, softened by age and sea air, gave way easily. From behind the frame, she pulled out a folded slip of paper, its edges brown with time. Elena's hands shook as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. The same elegant script she remembered from birthday cards and recipe notes. Her grandmother's penmanship, as distinctive as her laugh had been. "To whoever finds this blessing," the note began, "may you know that love lived here." Elena sank into a nearby chair, her cleaning cloth forgotten on the windowsill. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. "In these rooms we danced after dinner. In this window seat I read stories to my children. By this hearth, we weathered storms and celebrated joys. These walls hold more than memories. They hold dreams that deserve to live again." She traced her finger over the words, feeling the slight indentations where her grandmother's pen had pressed into the paper decades ago. "When we had to leave, I tucked this blessing away like a seed waiting for spring. Perhaps you are family, returned home. Perhaps you are a stranger who will make new memories here. Either way, know that this house was built for love, not fortune. Its true wealth lies in welcome." The morning passed in a blur as Elena kept returning to the note, reading it over and over. She thought about Thomas's quiet determination to honor his mother's wish, about the way he'd worked alongside her instead of above her, about all the small kindnesses that had helped her begin to trust again. When evening came, she found Thomas on the porch, where they often ended their days. He was watching the waves roll in, his expression thoughtful. "I found something today," Elena said softly, settling into the chair beside him. The paper felt warm in her hands, as if it held some of her grandmother's spirit. "Would you like to hear it?" Thomas turned to her, his eyes gentle. "Please." In the fading light, Elena read the blessing aloud. Her voice caught on certain phrases. Love lived here, and dreams that deserve to live again. But she pressed on, wanting Thomas to hear every word. When she finished, the sound of the waves filled the silence between them. Thomas looked out at the darkening ocean, then back at the house behind them. "Your grandmother was right," he said finally. "This place was never meant to be about wealth or status. That's why I couldn't just sell it or turn it into something fancy." Elena nodded, understanding flowing between them. "It needs to be a home again, a real home, where people feel welcomed and loved." "Like it was when your grandmother lived here," Thomas agreed, "and like it can be again." The porch creaked gently beneath them as they sat together, the blessing resting between them like a promise. The estate's windows glowed warmly behind them, no longer looking abandoned, but anticipating new life, new welcome, new love. Elena sat at the kitchen table the next morning, a fresh notebook open before her. Sunlight spilled across the wooden surface, warming her hands as she wrote. She'd been up since dawn, walking through each room of the estate, taking notes on what needed repair, what could be saved, and what had to be replaced entirely. Thomas had given her complete control over the restoration plans, his trust both thrilling and sobering. "You know this place better than anyone now," he'd said simply. "It's in your blood." She tapped her pen against the paper, considering the grand entrance hall. The chandelier needed rewiring, but its crystal drops were intact, just waiting to shine again. The wooden banister had good bones under years of neglect. She wrote carefully, "Strip paint from banister. Test small area first for original finish." The kitchen door creaked open, and Thomas entered with several paint sample books and bundles of fabric swatches. "The suppliers can start deliveries next week," he said, setting everything down beside her notebook. "Whatever you need." Elena picked up a paint fan, its colors ranging from soft sea foam to deep ocean blue. "The living room walls," she said thoughtfully. "They would have been lighter back then. I remember my grandmother mentioning how the room caught the morning light." Thomas pulled up a chair, spreading out the fabric samples. "These are all period appropriate," he explained. "The mill still uses original patterns from that era." Elena ran her fingers over a floral print that could have come straight from her childhood memories. Her grandmother had described curtains just like these, dancing in the summer breeze. The morning passed in a comfortable rhythm as they worked. Elena detailed her vision for each room, while Thomas made calls to craftsmen and suppliers. She found herself speaking with growing confidence, her initial hesitation melting away as Thomas supported each decision with quiet approval. By late afternoon, the table was covered with sketches, samples, and lists. Elena's notebook was half full of precise instructions about wood restoration, plaster repair, and paint colors. It felt right, like piecing together a beloved family quilt. As evening approached, Thomas disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 bowls of simple vegetable soup and fresh bread. "Time for a break," he said firmly. They cleared a corner of the table, pushing aside the day's work. The soup's warmth and familiar smell reminded Elena of comfort, of homes and hearts being restored. "Did I tell you about the bird's nest I found in the library shutters?" Thomas asked as they ate. "No, what happened?" "Well, I was replacing the hinge, and this tiny sparrow dive-bombed my head." Thomas demonstrated with his spoon, and Elena felt something bubble up inside her, a genuine laugh, unexpected and free. "She probably thought you were stealing her eggs," Elena said, still chuckling. "She did. Took me 15 minutes to convince her I meant no harm. I ended up moving to a different shutter until she calmed down." Elena laughed again, and this time she recognized the feeling washing over her. The tight knot of past hurts, the betrayal of her ex-fiancé, the financial struggles, the loss of direction, seemed to loosen its grip. Here, surrounded by paint samples and restoration plans, sitting across from someone who valued both the house's history and her connection to it, she felt the weight of her past beginning to lift. She soaked up the simple pleasure of good soup, honest work, and shared laughter. The estate's renewal wasn't just about fixing old shutters and stripped paint. It was about rediscovering joy in unexpected places. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when the first truck pulled up the estate's long driveway. Elena stood on the front porch, coffee mug warming her hands, as Bill Thompson, the local carpenter, stepped out of his weathered pickup. His toolbox gleamed with the same well-worn care as his trusted hands. "Morning, Miss Elena," he called out cheerfully. "Heard you've got some woodwork needing attention." Before Elena could respond, another vehicle appeared, Mrs. Martinez from the hardware store, her station wagon loaded with cleaning supplies and fresh-baked goods. "I brought reinforcements," she announced, holding up a basket of still warm muffins. Thomas emerged from the house, greeting everyone with his characteristic quiet warmth. "The community remembers this place," he explained softly to Elena. "They want to be part of bringing it back." More neighbors arrived throughout the morning. The Peterson sisters came with buckets and scrub brushes. Old Mr. Jenkins brought his ladder and decades of experience with historic homes. The estate, so long silent, now hummed with activity and purpose. Bill examined the grand staircase, running experienced fingers along the banister. "Good wood under here," he nodded approvingly. "We'll have her gleaming again in no time." Elena moved from room to room, coordinating efforts and sharing her vision for each space. The neighbors listened intently, offering suggestions based on their memories of the house in its prime. Mrs. Martinez recalled attending garden parties here as a girl, while Mr. Jenkins remembered delivering groceries to Elena's grandmother. Thomas worked steadily alongside everyone else, helping Bill remove damaged boards and carrying supplies where needed. Elena noticed how naturally he fit into the group, never drawing attention to himself, but always ready with a helping hand or quiet word of encouragement. As afternoon settled in, the progress was visible. The entrance hall sparkled, years of grime scrubbed away by determined hands. Bill had already replaced 3 broken balusters, matching the original woodwork perfectly. The Peterson sisters had cleared decades of cobwebs from the library's ceiling. Elena found Thomas in the kitchen, organizing tools for the next day's work. "Thank you," she said simply, "for letting everyone help, for understanding this isn't just about restoring a house." "This place matters to them too," Thomas replied, his voice gentle. "A home like this holds everyone's memories." "But you're the one who made it possible," Elena persisted. "You could have just hired a construction crew, done everything professionally. Instead, you've let it become this community effort." Thomas paused in his work, considering her words. "It's not kindness, really," he said finally. "It's just who I am. I believe in doing things the right way, even if it takes longer, even if it's harder." He met her eyes. "This house deserves to be loved back to life, not just repaired." Something shifted in Elena's chest at his words, a recognition of the depth behind his quiet manner. This wasn't just about fulfilling a promise or doing a good deed. This was Thomas's true nature, patient, thoughtful, and genuinely invested in restoring not just buildings, but connections. As they stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the day's evidence of community care, Elena felt a deeper appreciation for the man before her. His kindness wasn't a mask or a strategy. It was as natural as breathing, as fundamental as the estate's sturdy foundations. The evening light slanted through newly cleaned windows, casting warm patterns across the floor. Outside, the last of the neighbors were gathering their tools, calling goodbyes and promises to return tomorrow. Inside, Elena and Thomas shared a moment of peaceful understanding, their connection strengthened by shared purpose and genuine respect. Morning light filtered through the study's freshly cleaned windows as Elena sat beside Thomas, facing Mr. Patterson, a local attorney with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. Stacks of documents covered the antique desk between them, each page representing another step in the complex process of transferring the estate. "The paperwork is straightforward," Mr. Patterson explained, adjusting his reading glasses. "But given the property's value and history, we want to ensure everything is done properly." He spread out several forms, pointing to highlighted sections with a weathered finger. Elena's hands twisted in her lap as she listened. The magnitude of what was being offered still felt overwhelming. She glanced at Thomas, who sat quietly beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "Miss Moore, Mr. Patterson continued, you should understand that this is an unconditional transfer. The estate would be entirely yours, free and clear of any obligations or restrictions." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Elena," he said softly, "I want to be absolutely clear about something." He met her eyes with characteristic gentleness. "This isn't just a gift to be accepted or rejected. It's your choice, completely. If you need more time, or if you decide this isn't what you want, that's perfectly fine." Elena's throat tightened at his words. Even now he was putting her comfort first, ensuring she felt no pressure or obligation. "The transfer process would take about 3 weeks, Mr. Patterson added. "During that time, you can review everything with your own attorney if you'd like. We can also arrange for a property assessment, though Mr. Whitaker has already had one done." Elena picked up one of the documents, her grandmother's name jumping out from the yellowed paper. "Could you explain the historical ownership again?" she asked, her voice stronger than she expected. Mr. Patterson nodded, pulling out the old records they'd found at the county office. "Your grandmother, Grace Moore, owned this property from 1962 to 1989. The sale was legal, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The circumstances were unfortunate. Financial pressures can force difficult choices." Thomas spoke up quietly. "That's why my mother wanted this made right. She knew your grandmother, Elena. She understood what this place meant to your family." The morning passed in a blur of explanations and details. Mr. Patterson was thorough, answering every question with patience and clarity. Throughout it all, Thomas remained a calm presence, never pushing, always ensuring Elena had space to think and process. As the attorney gathered his papers to leave, he left a folder with Elena. "Take your time," he said kindly. "Read through everything. We can proceed whenever you're ready." The rest of the day, Elena moved through her usual tasks, but her mind kept returning to the decision before her. She cleaned windows, helped the local volunteers with repairs, and tended to the garden, all while turning over the possibilities in her heart. As evening settled over the estate, Elena found herself in the garden she'd helped restore. The newly planted flowers were beginning to show promise, reaching toward the sky with determined stems. She touched a tender leaf, remembering how her grandmother used to say gardens were about faith in tomorrow. Standing there in the growing dusk, surrounded by the gentle evidence of renewal, Elena felt something settle in her heart. This wasn't just about accepting a gift, or even reclaiming a lost family home. It was about honoring her grandmother's legacy, the love she'd poured into this place, the welcome she'd extended to others. the strength she'd shown even in letting it go. Elena looked up at the estate, its windows now glowing warmly in the twilight. She thought of Thomas's quiet kindness, the community's embrace, and her grandmother's blessing hidden in the window frame. With a deep breath, she made her decision. She would accept the estate, not as an ending to a story, but as a responsibility to carry forward. Morning sunlight streamed through the study windows, casting warm patches on the polished desk, where Thomas carefully laid out the transfer documents. Elena sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, trying to steady her nerves. "I want to go through each page with you," Thomas said, his voice gentle but clear. "No rushing, no pressure. We'll take as long as you need to understand everything completely." Elena nodded, setting down her coffee. The stack of papers looked less intimidating in the morning light, but their importance still made her heart flutter. Thomas slid the first document forward. "This is the main deed transfer," he explained, pointing to specific sections. "It states that the entire property, including the main house, grounds, and all structures, transfers to you with no conditions or restrictions." "No conditions at all?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas shook his head. "None. Once you sign, the estate is yours to do with as you choose. Sell it, keep it, change it, whatever you decide is right." He paused, making sure she met his eyes. "I trust your judgment completely." They spent the next hour going through every document. Thomas explained each clause and provision with patient detail, answering Elena's questions without hesitation. He showed her where Mr. Patterson had marked each signature line with small yellow tabs. "This section," Thomas said, "confirms that the transfer is free of any liens or encumbrances. The property taxes are paid through the end of the year." He pulled out another document. "And this one details the current insurance policy, which will transfer to your name." Elena's fingers traced her grandmother's name on one of the old documents. "I still can't quite believe this is happening," she admitted. Thomas smiled softly. Sometimes the right things take time to find their way home. They worked through the morning and into early afternoon. Thomas insisted they break for lunch, giving Elena time to process everything they'd reviewed. When they returned to the study, the final documents waited on the desk. "There's one more thing," Thomas said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small wooden box, aged but well cared for. "These are all the original keys to the estate. My mother kept them labeled." He opened the box to reveal dozens of brass keys, each with a small tag attached. Elena's eyes welled up at the sight. Each key represented another piece of trust being placed in her hands. The signing itself was both momentous and simple. Elena's hand trembled slightly as she signed her name on each marked line, Thomas serving as witness. With each signature, she felt the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a sacred trust. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the study windows, Elena held the wooden box of keys in her lap. The signed documents were carefully stored in a folder, ready to be filed with the county office the next day. "Thank you," she said to Thomas, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for the estate, but for how you've done this, for making sure I understood everything, for giving me time, for—" She struggled to find the right words. "For trusting me with something so precious." Thomas's response was characteristic of his quiet nature. A gentle nod, his eyes reflecting understanding of all the things Elena couldn't quite express. The moment held the weight of promises kept, and new beginnings, sealed with nothing more than trust and gratitude in the growing evening shadows. Elena woke before dawn, her heart already racing with anticipation. Today would mark the first time the estate opened its doors to the community since the restoration work began. She moved through her morning routine with careful attention, wanting everything to be perfect. In the kitchen, she arranged fresh-baked cookies on her grandmother's old serving plates, a touch that felt right for the occasion. The scent of coffee and vanilla filled the air as she worked, checking and rechecking her list of preparations. "Need any help?" Thomas appeared in the doorway, carrying a box of paper napkins they'd picked up from town the day before. "Could you set these flowers around?" Elena handed him several mason jars filled with wildflowers from the garden. "I thought we could put them in the main rooms we're showing." The morning light grew stronger as they worked together, placing flowers, arranging chairs, and making sure every room sparkled. Elena had insisted on doing most of the cleaning herself, though Thomas had quietly helped with the heavier tasks. By mid-morning, the estate looked better than it had in decades. The restored shutters gleamed with fresh paint, windows sparkled in the sunlight, and the garden beds burst with early blooms. Even the old wooden floors seemed to glow after weeks of careful polishing. "The porch looks wonderful, Mrs." Peterson called out as she arrived early, bearing a homemade pie. She was the first of several neighbors who had helped with the restoration, each one carrying food or flowers. Elena welcomed them warmly, touched by their enthusiasm. These people had known her grandmother, had loved this place in their own way, and their presence felt right. Thomas stayed in the background, helping where needed but letting Elena take the lead. The local carpenter who'd helped repair the banister arrived with his family. "This place has its heart back," he said, patting the newly restored railing with affection. More townspeople arrived, filling the rooms with chatter and laughter. Elena moved among them, sharing stories about the restoration and listening to their memories of the estate in earlier days. Each room held new life now. The parlor with its refreshed wallpaper, the library with reorganized shelves, the sunroom where plants once again thrived in the light. "Your grandmother would be so proud," one elderly woman told Elena, squeezing her hand. "She always said this place needed someone who could love it properly." The afternoon stretched on pleasantly. Children played carefully in the garden, while adults toured the rooms, exclaiming over details and sharing memories. Elena felt a deep sense of rightness, watching the estate fill with life and community again. Thomas caught her eye from across the room and smiled, raising his coffee cup in a small salute. Elena smiled back, grateful for his steady presence through all of this. The joy in the house felt tangible, warming every corner with laughter and conversation. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows, Elena stood on the porch, watching people enjoy themselves. The evening had turned out better than she'd imagined, full of genuine warmth and celebration. Then she saw it, a familiar car turning into the long driveway. Her heart stopped for a moment as she recognized the driver. James, her ex, was pulling up to the estate. He stepped out of his car, looking exactly as she remembered, and Elena felt her carefully built happiness waver. The sounds of celebration continued behind her, but Elena stood frozen on the porch, watching James walk toward the house with the confident stride she once knew so well. As the last neighbors waved goodbye and headed down the driveway, James approached Elena on the porch. The setting sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards, and the evening air had turned cool against her skin. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of charm and authority that once made her heart flutter. Now it just made her stomach clench. "The place looks amazing. I heard you were working on some old estate, but I had no idea it was something like this." She gripped the porch railing, steadying herself. "What are you doing here, James?" "I came to apologize." He took a step closer, and Elena instinctively moved back. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since you left. I handled things badly." Through the window behind her, Elena could hear Thomas clearing away plates in the kitchen, the quiet domestic sounds anchoring her to the present moment. "That's putting it mildly," Elena said, her voice stronger than she expected. "You made it clear what you thought of my dreams, called them childish, if I remember correctly." James ran a hand through his hair, that old nervous gesture she once found endearing. "I was wrong. Look at what you've accomplished here." He gestured at the restored estate. "I should have supported you instead of telling me I was wasting my time, instead of making me feel small every time I talked about wanting something different." The words tumbled out, months of hurt finally finding voice. Inside, she heard Thomas moving dishes more slowly, clearly staying within earshot while giving her space to handle this herself. His subtle presence gave her strength. "I miss you," James said softly. "When I heard about this open house, I thought maybe it was a sign, a chance to make things right." Elena looked at the estate behind her, the fresh paint, the blooming garden, the warmth spilling from windows that no longer leaked. Every repair represented a piece of herself she'd recovered. "There's nothing to make right, James. You showed me exactly who you were, and I'm grateful for that now. It led me here." She straightened her shoulders. "I'd like you to leave." "Elena, please, we could start over. I'm different now." "No." The word came out firm and clear. "I'm different now, and this is my home." James opened his mouth to argue, but something in Elena's stance made him pause. After a long moment, he nodded stiffly and turned away. Elena watched him walk to his car, the same way she'd watched him drive away from their apartment months ago. This time, though, she felt no urge to call him back. When his taillights disappeared down the drive, Elena went inside. The kitchen glowed with warm light, and Thomas was wiping down counters, his movements deliberate and calm. He glanced up as she entered but didn't speak, letting her process the moment in her own way. Elena's hands shook slightly as she picked up a dish towel and began drying the clean plates. The simple task helped ground her. Thomas worked quietly beside her, his steady presence a contrast to James's demanding energy. "Tea?" Thomas asked softly after a while. Elena nodded, grateful for the ordinary gesture. She sat at the kitchen table while Thomas filled the kettle, the familiar routine of their evening settling around her like a comfort. Outside the window, crickets began their evening song, and the estate stood solid and sure around them, protecting its own. Morning sunlight filtered through the sea mist as Elena stepped onto the front porch with her coffee. Her peaceful moment shattered when she spotted Marcus leaning against the iron gate, dressed in what she recognized as his business casual outfit, the one he wore when trying to close important deals. Her hands tightened around her coffee mug. She'd known he wouldn't give up easily. It wasn't in his nature to accept rejection. "Elena," he called out, his voice carrying across the dew-dampened lawn. "Just give me 5 minutes." She took a deliberate sip of coffee, making him wait. Through the screen door, she heard Thomas moving in the kitchen, probably preparing breakfast. His quiet presence gave her strength. "You shouldn't be here, Marcus," she said finally, loud enough for him to hear, but keeping her tone measured. He pushed off from the gate and started walking up the path. "Come on. We both know this isn't just about the estate. You've done amazing work here. Imagine what we could do together. My business sense, your vision." Elena stepped forward to the edge of the porch, holding up her hand to stop his advance. "That's far enough." To her surprise, he actually stopped. "You're angry. I get it. I was controlling. I tried to change you. But people can grow, Elena. I've learned from my mistakes." "This isn't about anger anymore," Elena said, setting her mug on the porch railing. "I'm not the same person you knew. The woman who let you diminish her dreams doesn't live here anymore. Marcus's charming smile slipped slightly. Is this about him? The quiet guy who owns the place? Thomas? No. Elena shook her head. This is about me. About finally understanding what I deserve. And what about what I deserve? Marcus's voice took on that familiar edge, the tone that used to make her scramble to smooth things over. Don't I deserve a chance to make things right? You don't deserve anything from me, Elena said firmly. Our relationship ended the moment you told me I was foolish for wanting more than a safe, predictable life under your control. That's not fair. Neither was making me feel worthless every time I talked about my dreams. Neither was telling me I should be grateful for your guidance. Elena's voice remained steady, though her heart raced. I don't owe you another chance. Marcus, please leave. He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working. This place has changed you. No, Elena said. It helped me remember who I always was. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but Elena turned and walked back inside, closing the door firmly behind her. Through the window, she watched him stand there, tension visible in his shoulders. Finally, he turned and stalked back to his car. Elena spent the next few hours working in the garden, trying to shake off the encounter. By late afternoon, she saw Marcus's car finally pull away from where he'd been parked down the road. She found Thomas in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for dinner. He looked up as she entered, but didn't push her to talk. I keep wondering, she said finally, sitting at the table, if I'm making a mistake. Not about Marcus, she added quickly. I'm sure about that, but about everything else. This place, the responsibility, trusting in good things again. Thomas set down his knife and turned to face her. Doubt isn't always a bad thing, he said quietly. Sometimes it means we're taking something seriously enough to question it. Elena nodded, letting his words sink in. Outside the window, the garden she'd planted caught the late afternoon light, new growth reaching toward the sky despite the lingering shadows. The evening settled over the estate like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the familiar sound of waves against the shore. Elena sat in one of the study's leather chairs, exhausted from the emotional toll of confronting Marcus. Thomas stood by his desk, his expression troubled as he pulled out a manila folder. There's something you need to see, he said quietly. I wasn't sure when to show you this, but after today... He paused, choosing his words carefully. I had my attorney look into some things while preparing the estate transfer. Standard procedure, making sure there were no liens or complications. Elena's stomach tightened. What did you find? Thomas sat in the chair across from her, placing the folder on the small table between them. The investigation uncovered some concerning financial activity from your joint accounts with Marcus. Elena's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, transaction records, and detailed reports. Her eyes scanned the pages, struggling to make sense of the numbers until patterns emerged. Patterns that made her blood run cold. These withdrawals, Thomas explained gently, pointing to highlighted lines. They were systematic, always just under amounts that would trigger notifications. They led to an offshore account. Elena's vision blurred as she traced the dates with her finger. The transactions lined up perfectly with times Marcus had insisted on handling their finances, claiming he was protecting their future. Times when he'd convinced her she was bad with money and needed his guidance. The total amount, Thomas hesitated before continuing, comes to just over $48,000. The number hit Elena like a physical blow. Her savings, the money she'd carefully set aside from her graphic design work, her inheritance from her parents, all of it gone. She remembered Marcus's constant reassurance that their money was growing, that his investment strategy was working. All lies. "I trusted him," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking of the old clock on the wall. "He said I was irresponsible with money, that I needed to let him handle everything." A bitter laugh escaped her. "And I believed him. I actually believed I was the problem." Thomas remained silent, letting her process the revelation at her own pace. Outside, a seabird called out, its cry seeming to echo Elena's internal anguish. "He came back because of the estate, didn't he?" Elena's hands clenched around the papers. "He probably thought I'd be the same person. Easy to manipulate, easy to control." "Elena," Thomas said softly, "none of this was your fault." She stared at the evidence of Marcus's betrayal, years of gaslighting and financial abuse laid bare in stark black and white. The careful planning it must have taken, the calculated way he'd undermined her confidence while systematically stealing her future, it was almost too much to comprehend. Rising abruptly, Elena gathered the papers with shaking hands. I need some time." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Elena walked woodenly from the study, clutching the folder to her chest. The estate's halls seemed longer than usual, shadows deeper in the corners. When she finally reached her room, she sank onto her bed, the weight of truth pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. In the quiet darkness, surrounded by the walls of her grandmother's home, Elena let the tears come. Not just for the money, but for the years of doubt, the carefully constructed lies, and the young woman who had believed she deserved it all. Chapter 20. Shame's Shadow. Scene 1. Dawn crept over the estate, painting the walls in soft grays and pinks, but Elena barely noticed. She'd been awake for hours, sitting on her bed with red-rimmed eyes, the folder of financial documents untouched beside her. The gentle knock on her door, announcing breakfast, went unanswered. When she finally emerged from her room, she grabbed a bucket of cleaning supplies and headed straight for the library, the dustiest, most neglected room in the house. Her movements were mechanical as she attacked cobwebs in corners and scrubbed at years of grime on the window panes. "You missed breakfast," Thomas said quietly from the doorway around mid-morning. Elena kept her back to him, furiously polishing a section of wood paneling. "Not hungry?" "Elena, please," she cut him off, her voice tight. "I need to work." The silence stretched between them before his footsteps retreated down the hall. Elena's shoulders slumped, but she didn't stop scrubbing. Physical labor was better than thinking, better than remembering how foolish she'd been. Each stroke of her cleaning cloth felt like penance for her naivety. The morning bled into afternoon. Elena moved from room to room, taking on the most difficult tasks she could find. She climbed a ladder to dust-sealing moldings, hauled boxes of old newspapers to the recycling, and attacked stubborn water stains on the marble fireplace surround. Her hands grew raw from cleaning solutions, but the discomfort was almost welcome, a distraction from the shame burning in her chest. Around 4 o'clock, she found herself in the front hall, staring at her reflection in the newly polished brass doorknob. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, someone who'd been fooled, manipulated, stolen from. Someone who didn't deserve the gift of this house. The thought stopped her cold. The estate, her grandmother's home. Thomas had trusted her with it, believed in her ability to restore and maintain it. But how could she be worthy of such responsibility when she couldn't even protect her own savings? When she'd let Marcus convince her she was incapable of managing money, the late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, reminding Elena she hadn't eaten all day. Her body ached from hours of physical labor, but the thought of facing Thomas in the kitchen was unbearable. Instead, She slipped out the back door and sat on the steps, listening to the distant surf. The sea air carried the scent of salt and seaweed, familiar and grounding. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of failure press down on her shoulders. All those years of working hard, saving carefully, planning for her future, gone because she'd trusted the wrong person. Because she'd let Marcus make her doubt herself. "Lord," she whispered, her voice catching. "I don't understand. You led me here, to this place, to these miracles. But how can I be trusted with something so precious when I was so blind, when I let myself be fooled so completely?" The waves continued their steady rhythm, offering no answer. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, fighting back fresh tears. The estate loomed behind her, beautiful and overwhelming. Thomas had given her this gift with such faith in her abilities, such belief in her strength. But now all she could see were her weaknesses, her failures. She thought of her grandmother Grace, wondering what she would think of her granddaughter now. Would she be disappointed? Would she understand how Elena had let herself be so thoroughly deceived? The question hung in the air as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the back garden. Elena remained on the steps, caught between gratitude and unworthiness, wondering if accepting the estate had been a mistake after all. The morning mist clung to the small coastal cemetery like a soft blanket. Elena knelt before her grandmother's headstone, tracing the letters of Grace Moore with trembling fingers. She'd brought fresh flowers, simple daisies that reminded her of the ones that used to grow wild around the estate. From her pocket, she pulled out the blessing they'd found in the window frame, its paper worn soft from her frequent handling. The early sunlight filtered through the trees as she read the familiar words aloud. "To whoever finds this message, may you return to what is true, and may you remember that worth isn't earned, it's discovered." "I don't know what's true anymore, Grandma," Elena whispered, arranging the daisies. "Thomas gave me back your home. Our home. But Marcus..." Her voice caught. "Marcus took so much more than money. He took my confidence, my trust in myself." A gentle breeze rustled the cemetery's oak trees, sending a shower of dewdrops onto Elena's shoulders. She stayed quiet for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of morning birds and early traffic. "The estate feels too big now," she continued. "Too important. I keep thinking about how you had to sell it, how hard that must have been. And here I am, handed this miracle, and I'm terrified I'll mess it up just like I messed up with Marcus." Elena pulled her grandmother's old photo from her bag, the one she'd found in the attic. Grace's smile beamed back at her, strong and certain, standing on the very porch Elena now called her own. "But you know what, Grandma? When I look at this picture, I see something I didn't notice before. You're standing alone. Not with Grandpa, not with Mom, just you. And you look powerful, like the estate didn't own you. You owned it." The morning sun broke through the clouds fully now, warming Elena's back. She traced her grandmother's face in the photograph, remembering the stories she'd heard in town about Grace's kindness, her determination, her quiet strength. "The blessing says, 'Return to what is true,'" Elena said softly. "Maybe what's true is that I'm not the same person Marcus knew. Maybe what's true is that I'm more like you than I realized." She stood slowly, brushing grass from her knees. The cemetery was peaceful, but Elena felt energy building inside her. Not anger, but something steadier. Something that felt like her grandmother's smile looked in that old photograph. "I've been hiding," she admitted to the headstone, "scrubbing floors and avoiding decisions, but that's not what you would do, is it? That's not what the woman in this photo would do." Elena tucked the blessing and photo back into her bag. The morning had grown warmer, the mist burning away to reveal a clear blue sky. She thought about Thomas, waiting back at the estate, respecting her space but ready to help if she asked. "I need to face Marcus," she said firmly. "Not because he deserves any explanation, but because I deserve to stand up for myself. Not hiding behind Thomas, not running away. Just me, being as strong as you were." She touched the headstone one last time, feeling the sun-warmed granite under her fingers. "Thank you, Grandma, for the blessing, for the example, for everything. I'm going to make you proud." Walking back to her car, Elena's steps felt lighter. She had decisions to make and confrontations to face, but for the first time since Marcus's return, she didn't feel small. She felt like Grace Moore's granddaughter, and that was exactly who she needed to be. The morning sun streamed through the cafe's front windows, casting long shadows across Elena's table. She'd arrived early, choosing a spot near the door where other customers could easily see her. A manila folder sat before her, containing the financial records Thomas had shown her. Her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, steadying herself as the bell above the door chimed. Marcus walked in, all easy smiles and casual confidence, as if their meeting was just another chance to charm her back. "Elena," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "You're looking well. The coastal air agrees with you." "Thank you for meeting me here," she said quietly, noticing how his familiar cologne no longer made her heart skip. Instead, it reminded her of all the times he'd used that scent to smooth over arguments. Marcus reached across the table to touch her hand, but Elena pulled back, placing both palms flat on the folder. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "If this is about us," Marcus began, but Elena cut him off by opening the folder. "This is about the truth," she said, laying out bank statements and transfer records. "This is about what you did to my savings while we were together." The smile flickered on Marcus's face. "I can explain." "I'm sure you can," Elena said. "You've always been good at explaining things, at making me doubt myself, at turning everything around until somehow it was my fault." She watched his expression shift, saw him preparing the words that used to wrap around her like silk chains. But this time, she spoke first. "Every transfer, every withdrawal, I have it all documented here." She tapped the papers. "You didn't just take my money, Marcus. You took my trust in myself." "It wasn't like that," he protested, lowering his voice. "We were building a future together. I had investments planned." "Stop!" Elena's voice was firm, but not angry. "I'm not here for explanations or excuses. I'm here to tell you that I know what happened, and it's over." Marcus leaned back, his charm falling away. "So that's it? You get yourself a nice house and suddenly you're too good for me?" "The estate has nothing to do with this," Elena said. "It showed me what genuine kindness looks like, what it feels like when someone respects your choices instead of manipulating them." She gathered the papers back into the folder, her movements deliberate and calm. "I forgive you, Marcus." He blinked, thrown off script. "You what?" "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." Elena stood up, holding the folder close. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just finished." "Elena, wait." Marcus started to rise, but she held up her hand. "No more waiting. No more explanations. No more chances." She looked at him directly, seeing him clearly for the first time. "Goodbye, Marcus." She walked out of the cafe into the bright morning light, leaving her coffee untouched, and Marcus staring after her. The sea breeze caught her hair, and Elena took a deep breath of salty air. Her steps were steady as she headed toward her car, the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. The manila folder felt light in her hands now. Just paper, just proof of something she'd already known in her heart. She didn't need it anymore to know her own worth. The truth had been written in her grandmother's blessing all along. Worth isn't earned. It's discovered. Elena returned to the estate as afternoon sunlight gilded the repaired shutters. She paused at the front gate, taking in the sight of her home. Not just a gift handed to her, but a testament to her own journey of rebuilding. Walking along the gravel path, she traced her finger across the fresh paint on the porch railing. Paint she had carefully chosen and applied herself. Each step reminded her of hours spent sanding, cleaning, and restoring. The garden beds she'd uncovered now burst with young plants, their leaves reaching toward the sky just as she was learning to do. Inside, she moved from room to room, seeing beyond the surface changes. The spotless windows weren't just clean glass. They represented her determination to let light back into her life. The polished floors reflected more than just care. They showed her willingness to start over, to work from the ground up. In the kitchen, she touched the worn counter where she and Thomas had shared simple meals. Here, she'd learned that kindness didn't always come with conditions. The dishes in the cupboard, the herbs drying by the window, these weren't just items in a house. They were pieces of the life she'd built while discovering her own strength. She climbed the stairs to her attic room, where it had all begun. The small space felt different now. That first night she'd been running away, seeking shelter. Now she stood in the same spot, no longer hiding but choosing to stay, choosing herself. The old photograph of her grandmother still sat on her dresser. Elena picked it up, studying the confident smile she'd inherited but forgotten how to use. "I understand now," she whispered to the image. "You didn't just love this place. You made it yours through work and care. Just like I'm doing." As evening approached, Elena heard Thomas's familiar footsteps on the porch. She went outside to join him, noticing how the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope. He stood at the railing, his presence steady but undemanding, just as it had been since the day she arrived. "I saw Marcus today," she said, watching the ocean waves in the distance. Thomas turned slightly, giving her his attention without pressure. "How are you feeling?" "Strong," Elena replied, and meant it. "I told him I forgive him, not for his sake, but for mine." She gripped the porch railing, feeling its solid support under her hands. "I chose myself today, maybe for the first time." "You've been choosing yourself every day you've been here," Thomas said quietly. "Every repair, every decision, every time you trusted your own judgment, those were all choices that honored who you are." Elena nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. "This place didn't save me," she said. "It gave me space to save myself." "That's what makes you remarkable, Elena," Thomas replied, his voice warm with respect. "You never needed saving. You needed to remember your own strength." The evening breeze carried the scent of the garden Elena had planted, sweet with new growth and possibility. She stood straighter, her shoulders relaxed, her heart steady. The woman who had stepped off that coastal bus with a worn suitcase and a bruised heart felt like a distant memory. In her place stood someone who had learned to trust herself again, someone who understood that true worth comes from within, not from what others give or take away. Morning light streamed through the kitchen windows as Elena set 2 coffee cups on the well-worn table. Thomas entered, his quiet presence familiar now in a way that felt like home. She'd been turning questions over in her mind all night, and this one needed asking. "Why didn't you tell me about Marcus sooner?" Elena watched Thomas's face carefully. "About the financial records?" Thomas settled into his chair, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. His eyes met hers with their usual steadiness. "I discovered it while processing your employment paperwork," he said. "The address history led me to some concerning patterns." "But you waited months to tell me." Elena's voice held no accusation, only curiosity. "I did." Thomas took a thoughtful sip of coffee. I wanted you to find your footing here first, to make choices based on who you are, not who hurt you. Elena considered this, remembering how fragile she'd felt those first weeks, how even the smallest decisions had seemed overwhelming. I was pretty broken when I arrived. Not broken, Thomas corrected gently. Wounded. There's a difference. A broken thing stays broken. A wound can heal. Through the window, Elena could see the garden she'd planted, thriving now in the morning sun. If you'd told me right away about what Marcus did, you might have stayed out of anger, Thomas finished, or left out of shame. Neither would have been a true choice. Elena thought about all the small moments that had built her strength back up. Sanding shutters until her arms ached, planting seeds in soil she'd cleared herself, learning to trust the quiet. You gave me space to remember who I was. The estate needed someone who could love it for itself, Thomas said. Not someone running from the past or hiding from pain. You needed the same chance, to choose your path freely. They sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the gentle ticking of the kitchen clock and distant waves. Elena traced the rim of her coffee cup, thinking about how different true kindness felt from the manipulation she'd known before. Thank you, she said finally. Not just for waiting, but for how you told me. You didn't use the information to rescue me or prove anything. You just showed me the truth and let me decide what to do with it. Thomas nodded, his expression warm. That's what real care looks like, Elena. It doesn't demand or direct. It supports and steps back. As evening settled over the estate, Elena sat in her favorite spot on the back steps. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and growing things. She realized something important. She hadn't thought about Marcus all day until now. Not because she was forcing herself to forget, but because her mind was full of other things. Real things. The estate's needs, the garden's progress, Thomas's steady presence. It wasn't that the hurt had magically vanished. Instead, it had been gradually replaced by something stronger. Safety. The kind that came from being truly seen and respected. From having space to grow. From kindness that asked nothing in return. The chaos and confusion of her life with Marcus felt distant now, like a storm that had passed. In its place was this, the solid ground beneath her feet, the sound of waves marking time, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she needed to be.